3261. Ar-Pharazôn sets sail and lands at Umbar. Now Sauron, knowing of the dissension in Númenor, thought how he might use it to achieve his revenge. He began therefore to assail the havens and forts of the Númenóreans, and invaded the coastlands under their dominion. As he foresaw this, aroused the great wrath of the king, who resolved to challenge Sauron the Great for the lordship of Middle-earth. Mariners of Númenor brought rumor of him. Some said that he was a king greater than the king of Númenor. Some said that he was one of the gods, or their sons set to govern Middle-earth. A few reported that he was an evil spirit. Perchance Morgoth himself returned. But this was held to be only a foolish fable of the wild man. The Lord sent messengers to the king and spake through the mountains of wise men and counseled him against this mission, for they said that Sauron would work evil if he came. And sitting upon his carven throne in the city of Armanelos, in the glory of his power, Ar-Pharazôn brooded darkly, thinking of war. For he had learned in Middle-earth of the strength of the realm of Sauron and of his hatred of Westernesse. And now there came to him the masters of ships and captains returning out of the east, and they reported that Sauron was putting forth his might, since Ar-Pharazôn had gone back from Middle-earth, and he was pressing down upon the cities by the coasts, and he had taken now the title of king and men, and declared his purpose to drive the Númenóreans into the sea, and destroy even Númenor if that might be. Great was the anger of Ar-Pharazôn at these tidings, and as he pondered long in secret, his heart was filled with the desire of power unbounded in the sole dominion of his will. And he determined without counsel of the Valar, or the aid of any wisdom but his own, that the title of king of men he would himself claim, and would compel Sauron to become his vassal and his servant, for in his pride he deemed that no king should ever arise so mighty as to vie with the heir of Eärendil. Therefore he began in that time to smith a great hoard of weapons, and many ships of war he built and stored them with his arms. For 5 years Ar-Pharazôn prepared, and when all was made ready he himself set sail with his host into the east. And men saw Ar-Pharazôn's sails coming up out of the sunset, dyed as with scarlet and gleaming with red gold, and fear fell upon the dwellers by the coasts, and they fled far away. But the fleet came at last to that place that was called Umbar, where was the mighty haven of the Númenóreans that no hand had wrought. Empty and silent were all the lands about when the king of the sea marched upon Middle-earth. For 7 days he journeyed with banner and trumpet, and he came to a hill, and he went up, and he set there his pavilion and his throne, and he sat him down in the midst of the land, and the tents of his hosts were ranged all about him, blue, golden, and white, as a field of tall flowers. Then he sent forth heralds, and he commanded Sauron to come before him and swear to him fealty. And Sauron came. Even from his mighty tower of Barad-dûr he came, and made no offer of battle, for he perceived that the power and majesty of the kings of the sea surpassed all rumor of them, so that he could not trust even the greatest of his servants to withstand them, and he saw not his time yet to work his will with the Dunedain. And he was crafty, well skilled to gain what he would by subtlety, when force might not avail. Therefore he humbled himself before Ar-Pharazôn, and smoothed his tongue, and men wondered, for all that he said seemed fair and wise. But Ar-Pharazôn was not yet deceived, and it came into his mind that, for the better keeping of Sauron and of his oaths of fealty, he should be brought to Númenor, there to dwell as a hostage for himself and all his servants in Middle-earth. To this Sauron assented as one constrained, yet in his secret thought he received it gladly, for it chimed indeed with his desire. This is a hard doom, said Sauron, but great kings must have their will, and he submitted as one under compulsion, concealing his delight, for things had fallen out according to his design. 3262. Sauron is taken as prisoner to Númenor. 3262 to 3310. Sauron seduces the king and corrupts the Númenóreans. Hoping to accomplish by cunning what he could not achieve by force, Sauron passed over the sea and looked upon the land of Númenor, and on the city of Armanelos in the days of its glory, and he was astounded. but his heart within was filled the more with envy and hate. Yet such was the cunning of his mind and mouth, and the strength of his hidden will, that ere 3 years had passed, he had become closest to the secret counsels of the king, for flattery sweet as honey was ever on his tongue, and knowledge he had of many things yet unrevealed to men. Now Sauron had great wisdom and knowledge, and could find words of seeming reason for the persuasion of all, but the most wary, and he could still assume a fair countenance when he wished. Great kings might have their will. This was the burden of all his advice, and whatever the king desired, he said, was his right, and devised plans whereby he might gain it. And seeing the favor that he had of their lord, all the counselors began to fawn upon him, save one alone, Amandil, lord of Andúnië. Then slowly a change came over the land, and the hearts of the elf friends were sorely troubled, and many fell away out of fear. And although those that remained still called themselves the faithful, their enemies named them rebels. For now, having the years of men, Sauron with many arguments gainsaid all that the Valar had taught, and he bade men think that in the world, in the east and even in the west, there lay yet many seas and many lands for the winning, wherein was wealth uncounted. And still, if they should at the last come to the end of those lands and seas, beyond all lay the ancient darkness, and out of it the world was made. For darkness alone is worshipful, and the Lord therefore may yet make other worlds to be gifts to those that serve him, so that the increase of their power shall find no end. And Ar-Pharazôn said, "Who is the Lord of the darkness?" Then behind locked doors Sauron spoke to the king, and he lied, saying, "It is he whose name is not now spoken. For the Valar have deceived you concerning him, putting forward the name of Eru, a phantom devised in the folly of their hearts, seeking to enchant men in servitude to themselves. For they are the oracle of this Eru, which speaks only what they will. But he that is their master shall yet prevail, and he will deliver you from this phantom, and his name is Melkor, Lord of all, giver of freedom, and he shall make you stronger than they." Then Ar-Pharazôn the king turned back to the worship of the dark, and of Melkor the lord thereof, at first in secret, but ere long openly and in the face of his people, and they for the most part followed him. Yet there dwelt still a remnant of the faithful, as has been told, at Romena and in a country near, and other few there were here and there in the land. The chief among them, to whom they looked for leading and courage in evil days, was Amandil, counselor of the king, and his son Elendil, whose sons were Isildur and Anarion, then young men by the reckoning of Númenor. Amandil and Elendil were great ship captains, and they were of the line of Elros Tar-Miniatur, though not of the ruling house, to whom belonged the crown and the throne in the city of Armanelos. In the days of their youth, together, Amandil had been dear to Pharazôn, and though he was of the elf friends, he remained in his council until the coming of Sauron. Now he was dismissed, for Sauron hated him above all others in Númenor. But he was so noble, and had been so mighty a captain of the sea, that he was still held in honor by many of the people, and neither the king nor Sauron dared to lay hands on him as yet. Therefore Amandil withdrew to Romena, and all that he trusted still to be faithful he summoned to come thither in secret, for he feared that evil would now grow apace, and all the elf friends were in peril. And so it soon came to pass, for the Meneltarma was utterly deserted in those days, and though not even Sauron dared to defile the high place, yet the king will let no man, upon pain of death, ascend to it, not even those of the faithful who kept the Iluvatar in their hearts. And Sauron urged the king to cut down the white tree, Nimloth the Fair, that grew in his courts, for it was a memorial of the Eldar and of the light of Vailnor. At the first, the king would not assent to this, since he believed that the fortunes of his house were bound up with the tree, as was forspoken by Tar-Palantir. Thus in his folly he, who now hated the Eldar and the Valar, vainly clung to the shadow of the old allegiance of Númenor. But when Amandil heard rumor of the evil purpose of Sauron, he was grieved to the heart, knowing that in the end Sauron would surely have his will. Then he spoke to Elendil and the sons of Elendil, recalling the tale of the trees of Vailnor, and Isildur said no word, but went out by night and did a deed for which he was afterwards renowned. For he passed alone in disguise to Armanelos into the courts of the king, which were now forbidden to the faithful, and he came to the place of the tree, which was forbidden to all by the orders of Sauron, and the tree was watched day and night by guards in his service. At that time Nimloth was dark and bore no bloom, for it was late in the autumn, as winter was nigh, and Isildur passed through the guards and took from the tree a fruit that hung upon it and turned to go. But the guards was aroused, and he was assailed, and fought his way out, receiving many wounds, and he escaped. And because he was disguised, it was not discovered who had laid hands on the tree. But Isildur came at last hardly back to Romena, and delivered the fruit to the hands of Amundil ere his strength failed him. Then the fruit was planted in secret, and it was blessed by Amundil, and a shoot arose from it and sprouted in the spring. But when its first leaf opened, then Isildur, who had lain long and come near to death, arose, and was troubled no more by his wounds. None too soon was this done, for after the assault the king yielded to Sauron and felled the white tree, and turned then wholly away from the allegiance of his fathers. But Sauron caused to be built upon the hill in the midst of the city of the Númenórians, Armanelos the Golden, a mighty temple, and it was in the form of a circle at the base, and there the walls were 50 feet in thickness, and the width of the base was 500 feet across the center, and the walls arose from the ground 500 feet, and they were crowned with a mighty dome. And that dome was roofed all with silver and rose glittering in the sun, so that the light of it could be seen afar off. But soon the light was darkened, and the silver became black. For there was an altar of fire in the midst of the temple, and in the topmost of the dome there was a lober, whence there issued a great smoke. And the first fire upon the altar Sauron kindled with the hewn wood of Nimloth, and it crackled and was consumed, but men marveled at the reek that went up from it, so that the land lay under a cloud for 7 days, until slowly it passed into the west. Thereafter the fire and smoke went up without ceasing, for the power of Sauron daily increased, and in that temple, with spilling of blood and torment and great wickedness, men made sacrifice to Melkor that he should release them from death. And most often from among the faithful they chose their victims, yet never openly on the charge that they would not worship Melkor, the giver of freedom. Rather it was cause sought against them that they hated the king and were his rebels, or that they plotted against their kin, devising lies and poisons. These charges were for the most part false, yet those were bitter days, and hate brings forth hate. But for all this death did not depart from the land, rather it came sooner and more often, and in many dreadful guises. For whereas aforetime men had grown slowly old, and I laid them down in the end to sleep, when they were weary at last of the world, now madness and sickness assailed them. And yet they were afraid to die and go out into the dark, the realm of the Lord that they had taken, and they cursed themselves in their agony. And men took weapons in those days and slew one another for little cause, for they were become quick to anger, and Sauron, or those whom he had bound to himself, went about the land setting man against man, so that the people murmured against the king and the lord, or against any that had aught that they had not, and the men of power took cruel revenge. Nonetheless, for long it seemed to the Númenórians that they prospered, and if they were not increased to happiness, yet they grew more strong, and the rich men ever richer, for which the aid and counsel of Sauron they multiplied their possessions, and they devised engines, and they built ever greater ships. And they sailed now with power and armory to Middle-earth, and they came no longer as bringers of gifts, nor even as rulers, but as fierce men of war. And they hunted the men of Middle-earth, and took their goods and enslaved them, and many they slew cruelly upon their altars, for they built in their fortresses temples and great tombs in those days, and men feared them, and the memory of the kindly kings of the ancient days faded from the world, and was darkened by many a tale of dread. Thus Ar-Pharazôn, king of the land of the star, grew to the mightiest tyrant that had yet been in the world since the reign of Morgoth, though in truth Sauron ruled all from behind the throne. So great was his power over the hearts of the most of that people that maybe had he wished he could have taken the scepter, but all that he wished was to bring Númenor to ruin. Therefore he said to the king, "One thing only now you lack to make you the greatest king in the world, the undying life that is withheld from you in fear and jealousy by the lying powers in the west. But great kings take what is their right." And Ar-Pharazôn pondered these words, but for long fear held him back. But the years passed, and the king felt the shadow of death approach as his days lengthened, and he was filled with fear and wrath. Now came the hour that Sauron had prepared and long had awaited. And Sauron spoke to the king, saying that his strength was now so great that he might think to have his will in all things, and be subject to no command or ban. And he said, "The Valar have possessed themselves of the land where there is no death, and they lie to you concerning it, hiding it as best they may because of their avarice, and their fear lest the kings of men should wrest from them the deathless realm and rule the world in their stead. And though doubtless the gift of life unending is not for all, but only for such as are worthy, being men of might and pride and great lineage, yet against all justice is it done that this gift, which is his due, should be withheld from the King of Kings, Ar-Pharazôn, mightiest of the sons of earth, to whom Manwë alone can be compared, if even he. But great kings do not brook denials and take what is their due." Then Ar-Pharazôn, being besotted and walking under the shadow of death, for his span was drawing towards its end, hearkened to Sauron, and he began to ponder in his heart how he might make war upon the Valar. 33:10 Ar-Pharazôn begins the building of the Great Armament. Ar-Pharazôn began to prepare a vast armament for the assault upon Vailnor that should surpass the one with which he had come to Umbar, even as a great galleon of Númenor surpassed a fisherman's boat. He was long preparing this design, and he spoke not openly of it, yet it could not be hidden from all. And Númenor, becoming aware of the purposes of the king, was dismayed and filled with a great dread, for he knew that men could not vanquish the Valar in war, and that ruin must come upon the world if this war were not stayed. Therefore he called his son Elendil, and he said to him, "The days are dark, and there is no hope in men, for the faithful are few. Therefore I am minded to try that counsel which our forefather Eärendil took of old, to sail into the west, be there ban or no, and to speak to the Valar, even to Manwë himself, if may be, and beseech his aid, ere all is lost." "Would you then betray the king?" said Elendil, "for you know well the charge that they make against us, that we are traitors and spies, and that until this day has been false." "If I thought that Manwë needed such a messenger," said Elendil, "I would betray the king, for there is but one loyalty, from which no man can be absolved in heart for any cause. But it is for mercy upon men, and their deliverance from Sauron the deceiver, that I would plead, since some at least have remained faithful. And as for the ban, I will suffer in myself the penalty, lest all my people should become guilty. But what think you, my father, is like to befall those of your house whom you leave behind when your deed becomes known?" "It must not become known," said Elendil. "I will prepare my going in secret, and I will set sail into the east, whither daily the ships depart from our havens, and thereafter, as wind and chance may allow, I will go about through south or north, back into the west, and seek what I may find. But for you and your folk, my son, I counsel that you should prepare yourselves other ships, and put aboard all such things as your hearts cannot bear to part with. And when the ships are ready, you shall lie in the haven of Númenor, and give out among men that you purpose when you see your time to follow me into the east. Elendil is no longer so dear to our kinsman upon the throne that he will grieve overmuch if we seek to depart for a season or for good. But let it not be seen that you intend to take many men, or he will be troubled because of the word that he now plots, for which he will need all the force that he may gather. Seek out the faithful that are known still to be true, and let them join you in secret if they are willing to go with you and share in your design." "And what shall that design be?" said Elendil. "To meddle not in the war, and to watch," answered Elendil. Until I return, I can say no more. But it is most like that you shall fly from the land of the star, with no star to guide you, for that land is defiled. Then you shall lose all that you have loved, for tasting death in life, seeking a land of exile elsewhere, but east or west, the Valar alone can say. Then Amandil said farewell to all his household as one that is about to die. For, said he, it may well prove that you will see me never again, and that I shall show you no such sign as the Arundel showed long ago. But hold you ever in readiness, for the end of the world that we have known is now at hand. It is said that Amandil set sail in a small ship at night, and steered first eastward, and then went about and passed into the west. And he took with him 3 servants, dear to his heart, and never again were they heard of by word or sign in this world, nor is there any tale or guess of their fate. Men could not a second time be saved by any such embassy, and for the treason of Númenor there was no easy absolving. But Elendil did all that his father had bidden, and his ships lay off the east coast of the land, and the faithful put aboard their wives and their children, and their heirlooms and great store of goods. Many things there were of beauty and power, such as the Númenórians had contrived in the days of their wisdom, vessels and jewels and scrolls of lore written in scarlet and black. And 7 stones they had, the gift of the Eldar, but in the ship of Isildur was guarded the young tree, the scion of Nimloth the Fair. Thus Elendil held himself in readiness and did not meddle in the evil deeds of those days, and there he looked for a sign that did not come. Then he journeyed in secret to the western shores and gazed out over the sea, for sorrow and yearning were upon him, and he greatly loved his father. But naught could he descry save the fleets of Ar-Pharazôn gathering in the havens of the west. Now, aforetime in the Isle of Numenor, the weather was ever apt to the needs and liking of men. Rain in due season and ever in measure, and sunshine, now warmer, now cooler, and winds from the sea. And when the wind was in the west, it seemed to many that it was filled with a fragrance, fleeting but sweet, heart-stirring as the flowers that bloom forever in undying meads, and have no names on mortal shores. But all this was now changed, for the sky itself was darkened, and there were storms of rain and hail in those days, and violent winds, and ever and anon the great ship of the Númenórians would founder and return not to haven, though such a grief had not till then befallen them since the rising of the star. And out of the west there would come at times a great cloud in the evening, shaped as if were an eagle, with pinions spread to the north and the south, and slowly it would loom up, blotting out the sunset, and then uttermost night would fall upon Númenor. And some of the eagles bore lightning beneath their wings, and thunder echoed between sea and cloud. The men grew afraid. "Behold the eagles of the lords of the west!" they cried. "The eagles of Manwë are come upon Númenor!" And they fell upon their faces. Then some few would repent for a season, but others hardened their hearts, and they shook their fists at heaven, saying, "The lords of the west have plotted against us. They strike first. The next blow shall be ours." These words the king himself spoke, but they were devised by Sauron. Now the lightnings increased and slew men upon the hills and in the fields and in the streets of the city, and the fiery bolts smote the dome of the temple and shore it asunder, and it was wreathed in flame. But the temple itself was unshaken, and Sauron stood there upon the pinnacle and defied the lightning and was unharmed. And in that hour men called him a god and did all that he would. When therefore the last portent came, they heeded it little, for the land shook under them, and a groaning as of thunder underground was mingled with the roaring of the sea, and smoke issued from the peak of the Meneltarma. But all the more did Ar-Pharazôn press on with his armament. 33:19 Ar-Pharazôn assails Vailnor. Downfall of Numenor. Elendil and his sons escape. In that time the fleets of the Númenórians darkened the sea upon the west of the land, and they were like an archipelago of 1,000 isles. Their masts were as a forest upon the mountains, and their sails like a brooding cloud, and their banners were golden and black. And all things waited upon the word of Ar-Pharazôn, And Sauron withdrew into the inmost circle of the temple, and men brought him victims to be burned. Then the eagles of the lords of the west came out of the dayfall, and they were arrayed as for battle, advancing in a line, the end of which diminished beyond sight. And as they came, their wings spread ever wider, grasping the sky. But the west burned red behind them, and they glowed beneath, as though they were lit with a flame of great anger, so that all Númenor was illumined as with a smoldering fire. And men looked upon the faces of their fellows, and it seemed to them that they were red with wrath. Then Ar-Pharazôn hardened his heart, and he went aboard his mighty ship, Ar-Pharazôn, castle of the sea. Many-oared it was, and many-masted, golden and sable, and upon it the throne of Ar-Pharazôn was set. Then he did on his panoply and his crown, and had raised his standard, and he gave the signal for the raising of the anchors, and at that hour the trumpets of Númenor outrang the thunder. Thus the fleets of the Númenórians moved against the menace of the west, and there was little wind, but they had many oars and many strong slaves to row beneath the lash. The sun went down, and there came a great silence. Darkness fell upon the land, and the sea was still, while the world waited for what should betide. Slowly the fleets passed out of the sight of the watchers in the havens, and their lights faded, and night took them, and in the morning they were gone. For a wind arose in the east, and it wafted them away, and they broke the band of the Vailnor and sailed into forbidden seas, going up with war against the deathless, to wrest from them everlasting life within the circles of the world. But the fleets of Ar-Pharazôn came up out of the deeps of the sea, and encompassed Ar-Pharazôn and all the isles of Eressëa, and the Eldar mourned, for the light of the setting sun was cut off by the cloud of the Númenórians. And at last Ar-Pharazôn came even to Aman, the blessed realm, and the coasts of Vailnor, and still all was silent, and doom hung by a thread. For Ar-Pharazôn wavered at the end, and almost he turned back. His heart misgave him when he looked upon the soundless shores, and saw Taniquetil shining, whiter than snow, colder than death, silent, immutable, terrible as the shadow of the light of Ilúvatar. But pride was now his master, and at last he left his ship and strode upon the shore, claiming the land for his own, if none should do battle for it. And a host of the Númenórians encamped in might about Tuna, once all the Eldar had fled. Namanwe, upon the mountain called upon Ilúvatar, and for that time the Valar laid down the government of Arda. But Ilúvatar showed forth his power, and he changed the fashion of the world, and a great chasm opened in the sea between Númenor and the deathless lands, and the waters flowed down into it, and the noise and smoke of the cataracts went up to heaven, and the world was shaken. And all the fleets of the Númenórians were drawn down into the abyss, and they were drowned and swallowed up forever. But Ar-Pharazôn the king and the mortal warriors that had set foot upon the land of Aman were buried under falling hills. There it is said that they lie imprisoned in the caves of the forgotten until the last battle in the day of doom. But the land of Aman and Eressëa of the Eldar were taken away and removed beyond the reach of men forever. And Ondor, the land of gift, Númenor of the kings, Elena of the star of Eärendil, was utterly destroyed. For it was nigh to the east of the great rift, and its foundations were overturned, and it fell and went down into darkness, and is no more. And there is not now upon earth any place abiding where the memory of a time without evil is preserved. For Ilúvatar cast back the great seas west of Middle-earth, and the empty lands east of it, and new lands and new seas were made, and the world was diminished, for Vailnor and Eressëa were taken from it into the realm of hidden things. In an hour unlooked for by men this doom befell on the 39th day since the passing of the fleets. Then suddenly fire burst from the metal tarma, and there came a mighty wind and a tumult of the earth, and the sky reeled, and the hills slid, and Númenor went down into the sea, with all its children and its wives and its maidens and its ladies proud, and all its gardens and its halls and its towers, its tombs and its riches and its jewels and its webs and its things painted and carven, and its laughter and its mirth and its music, its wisdom and its lore, they vanished forever. And last of all, the mounting wave, green and cold and plumed with foam, climbing over the land, took to its bosom Tar Muriel the queen, fairer than silver or ivory or pearls. Too late she strove to ascend the steep ways of the Meneltarma to the holy place, for the waters overtook her, and her cry was lost in the whirring of the wind. But whether or no it were that Amandil came indeed to Vailnor, and Manwë hearkened to his prayer by grace of the Vala, Elendil and his sons, and their people were spared from the ruin of that day. For Elendil had remained in Romana, refusing the summons of the king when he set forth to war, and avoiding the soldiers of Sauron that came to seize him and drag him to the fires of the temple, he went aboard his ship and stood off from the shore, waiting on the time. There he was protected by the land from the great draught of the sea that drew all towards the abyss, and afterwards he was sheltered from the first fury of the storm. But when a devouring wave rolled over the land and Númenor toppled to its fall, then he would have been overwhelmed and would have deemed it the lesser grief to perish, for no wrench of death could be more bitter than the loss and agony of that day. But the great wind took him, wilder than any wind that men had known, roaring from the west, and it swept his ships far away, and it rent their sails, and snapped their masts, hunting the unhappy men like straws upon the water. 9 ships there were, 4 for Elendil, and for Isildur 3, and for Anarion 2, and they fled before the black gale out of the twilight of doom into the darkness of the world. And the deeps rose beneath them in towering anger, and waves like unto mountains, moving with great caps of wind and snow, bore them up amid the wreckage of the clouds, and after many days cast them away upon the shores of Middle-earth. And all the coasts and seaward regions of the western world suffered great change and ruin in that time, for the seas invaded the lands, and shores foundered, and ancient isles were drowned, and new isles were uplifted, and hills crumbled, and rivers were turned into strange courses. Of the changes brought about in the tumult of the winds and seas that followed the downfall, it is written in the tale of years of the Second Age, but nowhere else. In some places the sea rode in upon the land, and in others it piled up new coasts. Thus while Lindon suffered great loss, the Bay of Belfast was much filled at the east and south, so that Pelargir, which had been only a few miles from the sea, was left far inland, and Anduin carved a new path by many miles to the bay. But the Isle of Tolfalas was almost destroyed, and was left at last like a barren and lonely mountain in the water not far from the issue of the river. Sauron himself was filled with great fear at the wrath of the Valar, and the doom that Eru laid upon sea and land. It was greater far than aught he had looked for, hoping only for the death of the Númenóreans and the defeat of their proud king. And Sauron, sitting in his black seat in the midst of the temple, had laughed when he heard the trumpets of Ar-Pharazôn sounding for battle, and again he had laughed when he heard the thunder of the storm, and a third time, even as he laughed at his own thought, thinking what he would do now in the world, being rid of the Edain forever. He was taken in the midst of his mirth, and his seat and his temple fell into the abyss. But Sauron was not of mortal flesh, and though he was robbed now of that shape in which he had wrought so great an evil, so that he could never again appear fair to the eyes of men, yet his spirit arose out of the deep and passed as a shadow in the black wind over the sea. But these things come not into the tale of the drowning of Númenor, of which now all is told. And even the name of that land perished, and men spoke thereafter not of Elena, nor of Andor the gift that was taken away, nor of Númenor on the confines of the world. But the exiles on the shores of the sea, if they turned toward the west in the desire of their hearts, spoke of Mornufalmar that was whelmed in the waves, Akalabeth the downfall of Talante in the Eldarin tongue. So ended the glory of Númenor. Among the exiles many believed that the summit of the Mount of Tarma, the pillar of heaven, was not drowned forever but rose again above the waves, a lonely island lost in the great waters, for it had been a hallowed place, and even in the days of Sauron none had defiled it. And some there were of the seeds of Arendelle that afterwards sought for it, because it was said among lore masters that the far-sighted men of old could see from the Mount of Tarma a glimmer of the deathless land. For even after the ruin, the hearts of the Dunedain were still set westwards, and though they knew indeed that the world was changed, they said, Avalone is vanished from the earth, and the land of Aman was taken away, and in the world of this present darkness they cannot be found. Yet once they were, and therefore they still are, in true being, and in the whole shape of the world as at first it was devised. For the Dunedain held that even mortal men, if so blessed, might look upon other times than those of their body's life, and they longed ever to escape from the shadows of their exile and to see in some fashion the light that dies not, for the sorrow of the thought of death had pursued them over the deeps of the sea. Thus it was that great mariners among them would still search the empty seas, hoping to come upon the Isle of Mount Tarma, and there to see a vision of things that were. But they found it not, and those that sailed far came only to the new lands, and found them like to the old lands and subject to death. And those that sailed further set but a girdle about the earth, and returned weary at last to the place of their beginning, and they said, All roads are now bent. Thus in after days, what by the voyages of ships, what by lore and starcraft, the kings of men knew that the world was indeed made round, and yet the Eldar were permitted still to depart and to come to the ancient west and to Avalone if they would. Therefore the lore masters of men said that a straight road might still be for those that were permitted to find it, and they taught that while the new world fell away, the old road and the path of the memory of the west still went on, as it were a mighty bridge invisible that passed through the air of breath and of flight, which were bent now as the world was bent, and traversed ailment which flesh unaided cannot endure, until it came to Tol Eressëa, the lonely out, and maybe even beyond to Vailnor, where the Valar still dwelt and watched the unfolding of the story of the world. And tales and rumors arose along the shores of the sea, concerning mariners and men forlorn upon the water, who, by some fate or grace or favor of the Valar, had entered in upon the straight way, and seen the face of the world sink below them, and so had come to the lamplit quays of Avalone, or verily to the last beaches on the margin of Aman, and there had looked upon the white mountain, dreadful and beautiful, before they died. In his letter to Milton Waldman, written 3 years before the publication of the Fellowship of the Ring, the author wrote of the disaster. Númenor itself, on the edge of the rift, topples and vanishes forever with all its glory in the abyss. Thereafter there is no visible dwelling of the divine or immortal on earth. Valinor, or Paradise, and even Eressëa are removed, remaining only in the memory of the earth. Men may sail now west, if they will, as far as they may, and come no nearer to Valinor or the Blessed Realm, but return only into the east, and so back again, for the world is round and finite, in a circle and inescapable, save by death. Only the immortals, the lingering elves, may still, if they will, wearying of the circle of the world, take ship and find the straight way, and come to the ancient or true west, and be at peace. The flight of Elendil and the exiles following the downfall was memorialized in a song about the tall kings and their tall ships. It was a rhyme that came into the mind of Gandalf as he and Pippin rode on Shadowfax towards Minas Tirith. Tall ships and tall kings, 3 times 3. What brought they from the foundered land over the flowing sea? 7 stars and 7 stones and 1 white tree. The calamitous events of the downfall will live long in the memories of the peoples of Middle-earth. In the Third Age, as all awaited the final outcome to the War of the Ring, Faramir and Éowyn stood upon the walls of Minas Tirith, the city of Gondor, looking towards the east and Mordor. It seemed to them that above the ridges of the distant mountains, another vast mountain of darkness rose, towering up like a wave that should engulf the world, and about it lightnings flickered, and then a tremor ran through the earth, and they felt the walls of the city quiver. A sound like a sigh went up from all the lands about them, and their hearts beat suddenly again. "It reminds me of Númenor," said Faramir, and wondered to hear himself speak. "Of Númenor?" said Eowyn. "Yes," said Faramir. "Of the land of Westernesse that foundered, and of the great dark wave climbing over the green lands and above the hills, and coming on, darkness unescapable. I often dream of it."